Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. This is our seventh Red May. I can hardly believe it. 7 great years. And we're starting off here with a program that I have anticipated for a long time. It's called Stepford Daughters. You'll recognize the allusion to the classic 60s film, The Stepford Wives. And I'd like to introduce our panelists now. Uh, Joe Isaacson is the author of Stepford Daughters, a book from Common Notions from our friend Malif Kanuga's wonderful new edition, which also has Mario Tronti books and all kinds of things that you can't find anywhere else. Joe is, in addition to being the author of Stepford Daughters, the editor of Blind Field, a film journal which has wonderful articles on feminist, anti-capitalist horror, and also she is the one of the, I guess, the founder of a group on Facebook called Anti-Capitalist Feminists Who Like Horror Films, which is another great source of information as to what to watch. Joe is going to be joined here by another Red Bay alum, Sophie Lewis, who is the author, of course, of Abolish the Family, and a first-time participant, Michael Truscello, who is the author of Infrastructural Brutalism. Welcome to Red May 7, everybody, and let's go. Let's hear about Stepford Daughters.
All right. Sorry, I'm trying to share my slides, which I did do before, and I'm just making sure that it will work now. Here we go. All right, so thanks so much to Philip, Sean, Kyle, Sophie, and Michael, and Mahim, who I just met, wonderful person. Having a Red May panel for Stepford Daughters is a real dream come true. Since the last Red May, we have suffered an unprecedented assault on reproductive autonomy that is more frightening than any horror film. In the face of this onslaught, we need more than reproductive rights. We need an analysis of the ways feminized reproduction, biological and otherwise, is consistently and structurally preyed upon by a parasitical system. In Stepford Daughters, I drew on my love of horror films and my fury at this predation to explore the ways that the monsters of capitalist exploitation and expropriation adapt to changing conditions. With the rise of feminized labor, such as gig work, service work, healthcare work, sex work, education work, and domestic labor, come worsening labor conditions and increasing immiseration of surplus populations. My tacit proposal in Stepford Daughters is that such conditions should not confine the feminist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic left to a life of hand-wringing and self-denial. As we battle for a better world, we deserve a fulfilling cultural life and an infusion of fun and camp into our politics. Part of this can be claiming popular culture for our own, using it not just as an entertainment, but a way to create symbolism and meaning. Horror offers a diagnosis of new forms of violence we face, while creating vengeful monsters and final girls who paradoxically embody our insurgent and utopian desires. Horror films are accessible to all, and in that spirit of accessibility, I tried to make Stepford Daughters intelligible to an interested and politicized, but not necessarily academic audience. I see the book as an extension of the work I do with my comrades editing Blind Field. And by the way, I'm definitely not the editor, where there's a few of us, a free public journal that takes an anti-capitalist feminist approach to analyzing culture. We feel it is important to reach a popular audience and fight for an emergent structure of feeling, as Raymond Williams puts it, that is leftist and feminist. As we are inundated with the language of austerity, capitalist realism, and moderation, cultural criticism can be the site for consciousness raising. Perhaps the most exciting thing about Stepford Daughters is its publisher, Common Notions, a politically committed, egalitarian small press. I hope all of you who enjoy Red May, another institution committed to nourishing the radical imagination, will check out common notions and consider becoming a sustainer. So here is a little bit from the introduction of the book. Sorry, let's see, make sure it's going there. You think you know this story. You think it's a story your mother told you. An ambitious woman with hopes and dreams enters a nightmare. She's trapped in her home, reduced to nothing but a caregiver. You think it's the story of Johanna from the 1975 film, The Stepford Wives. Johanna was smart and educated. She loved photography and dirty jokes. But once she moves to Stepford's, her husband joins a men's society that has a plan for unruly spouses to turn them into robot housewives, content with a friendless, jobless life of chores and husbands, dust and dirt. 42 years later, another woman, Amelia, is trapped in a suburban house with her difficult son. By day, she tries to keep it together, and at night, a cadaverous spectral monster stalks her dreams. She becomes increasingly dissociated. Her mind drifts darkly as she washes the dishes and cleans the house. In the kitchen, she finds a slit in the wall pouring out cockroaches. Later, as she lies sleepless at night, an ominous shadow spreads across the ceiling, suddenly flying into her petrified, screaming mouth. After this, she will no longer be an exhausted mother, but the powerful, murderous Babadook, ready to slaughter her own child to get back the husband she's lost. Like Johanna, Amelia is driven to horrific extremes by domestic life. Some things never change. And yet things have changed. Johanna was depicted as a victim of what Betty Friedan called the problem with no name, entrapment in the home. You can see women affiliated with this unutterable difficulty march in lockstep. The robotic Stepford wives in their matching aprons, plastered smiles, obsessing over their cleaning products, having relinquished all aspirations and independence. The cure prescribed to them was to get out of their suburban homes and into the job market. This is not the way out for our single working mom, Amelia. She suffers the demeaning horrors of domestic life, but her terrors don't stop at the threshold of the home. Inside and outside her gloomy house, she's stretched to the max, working a precarious job as a care worker in an old age home, where abandoned elders clamor for her constant emotional labor. The work world has not solved her problems, but compounded them. As the pressures overtake her, building to her demonic possession, she calls in sick to her workplace. In response, all her work shifts are taken away, leaving Amelia's future even more uncertain and strained. It is only then, when the full weight of this merciless world is bearing down on her, that she fully transforms into the monster. In thinking about the transition from the Stepford Wives to the Babadook, we can look back to classic horror films that captured their audiences by building a genealogy or line of descent. In the 30s, we encounter such titles as Son of Frankenstein and Dracula's Daughters that built on the popularity of name recognition monsters. While this is no longer the style, horror films are still adept at forming critical lineages. There's a continuous thread of feminist critique throughout the history of horror, but the terms of this criticism mutate to suit changing realities. In this sense, Amelia is, like other feminized people of horror discussed in this book, a Stepford daughter. By this, I mean that the women of contemporary horror and of the present world at large have inherited the oppressive conditions of the housewife, but are examples of how these problems historically transform. We don't want to forget what our mothers struggled for and against. As we face a bleak neoliberal world of austerity and precarity, however, we need to know how gendered oppression works now. As I imagine Amelia's backstory, I see her growing up in the suburbs, tended by a mother zoned out on Quaaludes and living to find the shiniest brand of floor wax. Or perhaps she really did grow up in the Australian version of Stepford, and her mother, like the characters in the film, was a creative woman who was literally turned into a robot to suit her husband's desire for a compliant and constantly sexually available wife. Either way, young Amelia is determined not to turn into this zombie progenitor. Like many women of my generation, X, she has great dreams that must be modified as the realities of capitalism crash in. In my imagination, she first decides to become a doctor, but when she sees the student loans and years of impoverished apprenticeships stretch out before her, she decides to think again. Then she resolves to be independent, but facing a world that offers only the couple form or abject loneliness, she concedes that she probably should get married. Still, this marriage won't be like her mother's. She'll at least work part-time. At first, she's thrilled to get paid to help others in a nursing home, but soon discovers that the facility where she works pushes this caring instinct to its limits. Understaffed and underequipped, it leaves her little time and energy to care for her wards, let alone her own household. Now, however, she finds she can't afford to quit. The family wage that enabled a man to support his wife and kids is a thing of the past, and even households with two incomes can't keep up. Welcome to the life of the new liberated woman. We enter Amelia's life after she's lost her husband to a car accident and find her struggling to take care of a son with special needs. When she searches for social supports, personalized education, and mental health help for herself and her son, she finds only judgment and rejection. As a Stepford daughter, she's devalued for the same reasons as her mother. Her feminized labor is seen as both worthless and natural. But she's no longer trapped in her middle-class house and nuclear family. Instead, she's set adrift in a sea of poverty and precarity. This is the endgame of a society that both relies on and disavows social reproduction. The Babadook is just one example of a canny new wave of horror films exploring phenomena we typically associate with patriarchy, such as women's confinement to the home, domestic labor, the pressure to look beautiful and young, the compulsion to be the perfect mother, the demand to be emotionally supportive while ignoring one's own needs, the fear of sexual assaults. The twist to these films is that they show how these traditional feminist concerns are linked to capitalism as a whole. In American Mary, a woman achieves a revenge against her rapist and defeats her student loans. In Maps to the Stars, a young woman destroys her abusive family and kills her boss. In Unfriended, the ghost of a girl driven to suicide by sexist bullying destroys her tormentors and social media. And in all of these cases, the films show how there is no way to separate gender depression from capitalist suppression. The fact is, we live in a world in which capitalism preys on age-old stereotypes about feminine activity. Women's work is seen as trivial and low-skilled, and this allows it to be ignored or poorly paid. The middle-class strains of second-wave feminism that shaped the logic of the Stepford Wives held out the hope that women's entry into the wage work world would be a moment of emancipation, but that was not at all the outcome. Instead, the jobs that women entered into, service labor, flexible labor, effective labor, were both expanded and degraded. It's no accident that in this moment, when the majority of employment growth is in service professions, wages have dropped. And with the exponential growth of professions done in the home, women, and especially women of color, are more and more likely to be employed in jobs that are widely considered to be abject or even neo-feudal. In this horror scenario, capitalism lures women into low-paid or no-paid work while disinvesting from programs of social welfare, leading to what Nancy Fraser calls a crisis of care. The alternative offered to women is corporate lean-in feminism, in which, as Dawn Foster asserts, there's no room for a civil life, a political life, and emotional life outside the nuclear family unit. Contemporary horror has recognized the monstrosity of this individualistic lean-in logic, especially in the work of South Korean director Bong Joon-ho. In his film Snowpiercer, the world has come to a halt due to global warming, and the only survivors live on a circumnavigational train in which classes are segregated by separate cars. Tilda Swinton, costumed to resemble Margaret Thatcher, plays Minister Mason, one of the most powerful people on the train. However, she uses her female empowerment as an iron fist to ensure no one transgresses their subordinated class position. In another Joon-ho film, Parasite, the Kim family rise from being slum-dwelling pizza box assemblers to well-paid domestic workers, living in the wealthy home of their employers. But rather than use their new found power.
We're having technical problems at the moment, as they say. It might be the intervention of some capitalist gremlin of some kind that we're getting all of our expert horror fighters to try to solve the problem. So we will be back on board, hopefully in seconds or a minute. Maybe what I should do is take the opportunity that this glitch has provided to do a quick pitch for Red May. We are, of course, unfunded by any nonprofit or profit. A program one of whose slogans is "Be a commie for a month" doesn't find a lot of institutional funding, or any, in fact. So we have a Patreon on our website. Go to Red May, Google us. You'll get to our website, and if you have a moment and you can afford it, please contribute monthly or whatever to us, so we can continue to bring you these programs, which have now expanded outside of May and occasionally are going year round. We just had a wonderful 8-week program by Jasper Burns on workers' councils. So again, please give to us. We depend on the kindness of strangers. And now I'll shut up, and we will just all put our minds together and pray that the technical glitch go away, the gremlin leave the stream, and Joe can. Should we have Sophie or Michael go now until we get Joe back to just kind of elaborate a little? Okay, let's do that. Let's have Sophie for a moment.
Hi, everyone. I just was going to wait until the end of Joe's presentation to ask some questions and perhaps segue into a conversation about a specific movie that we all find very interesting. But for now, I'll just sort of fill this gap by sharing that it took me some time to understand how horror, this kind of historically low genre, while I think indisputably full of reactionary elements, and not to mention sort of at best volatile social or political impulses, has also served populations that are systematically exploited, violated, and hunted as a form of entertainment that doubles as a sort of sandbox for externalizing trauma, a space of release, perhaps of traumatic repetition in a contained context of safety, thus even conceivably of potential healing. And I'm domestically partnered with someone who watches thousands of horror movies, who studied slashers for her undergraduate specialization, and who regularly goes to horror-thons. So over the past decade, with her and with Joe, my initial aversion to horror has been turned into appreciation, albeit my enjoyment is always charged with suffering. I scream so viscerally, or so I am told, that I make any movie 20 to 40% more intense for my companions. And this is called the Sophie scariness bump. But Johanna, Joe Isaacson's relationship to horror has been my guide and my model ever since she and the other co-founder of this brilliant anti-state feminist platform, Blindfield, Madeline Lane McKinley, who is the author of another Common Notions book, Comedy Against Work, invited me to participate in the Blindfield Collective around 2016. So with Joe as my sort of horror mommy and Madeline as my comedy mommy. I learned how to interpret movies and TV shows against the grain, sort of drawing out the radical proletarian sort of self-abolitionist desires and the queer and trans feminist dreams, and perhaps above all the anti-utopian valences lurking in contemporary culture. And I guess that phrase, sort of anti-utopian, comes from Frederick Jameson, a figure I know is important to Madeline and Jo in equal measure. So reading the upshot of many years of sort of feminist, anti-capitalist salon curation almost, sort of Stepford Daughters, weapons for feminists in contemporary horror, sort of shows me, in the tradition of Leopoldina Fortunati, Maria Rosa della Costa, and others, how the task of visibilization, i.e. naming the work and naming the violence of gendered oppression as it exists today, and the twinned task of denaturalization, i.e. making the present state of things appear unacceptable, unbearable, unnecessary, and transformable, are the indispensable preconditions of any next steps we might collectively make toward feminist utopia. Jo writes that horror films often, quote, help us understand that the exploitation of social reproduction makes the capitalist system possible, unquote. But in the tradition of Kathy Weeks and others, this is not moral praise, right? It is important in Stepford Daughters to go beyond this kind of assertion of importance, right, into a truly difficult affective space. Citing Benjamin, Jo talks about how horror movies help us grapple affectively with the vertigo of rejecting the logic of progress, which, quote, demands that we instrumentalize all our best qualities, our love, our gentleness, our resilience, our wildness, unquote. So perhaps we might even consider, again, quoting Jo, that unhappiness can be a form of rebellion against a definition of happiness that goes against our own true potential for joy, unquote. So this is not a book against love in a transhistorical sense, but it is a book against love in the present state of things. It's and potentially against happiness. And this is how horror helps us kind of begin together to experience what it might be like to have to destroy capitalist happiness, i.e. the happiness that we know, in the attempt of reaching a red love or a red happiness in the future. My own work, having focused on the issue of family and the abolitionism of the private care technology that is called the family, I'm gonna just close out these remarks by quoting the part of Stepford Daughters where Jo very pithily kind of condenses what I too am always trying to get across, which is that, quote, the family structure itself is killing us. This is not because people in families don't love each other. Rather, it's because the family is the excuse to privatize the process of reproduction, feeding, clothing, housing, and caring for people, instead of offering external support. Faced with a social void, the family has to take on all this work itself, whereas the family and all social forms should be solely dedicated to love, care, mutual aid, and creativity. The family is instead wrenched into the service of capitalism, taking care of the duties that would be more humanely provided by the public, or perhaps by the commons. I really think you should go and read this book. I think you'd be surprised if you don't think you're interested in horror, you'll find that you in fact are. Okay, over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Yeah, initially I was going to focus on my comments on a question for Joe. Actually, I've used Joe's writings in my intro to horror class in years past before the book came out, and I'll certainly assign the book in the next time that I teach intro to horror. It's it's really the sort of perfect combination of understanding the genre and its history, and understanding the questions that leftists might have about horror. A kind of perfect combination of the two. So it does address the question of, in a world that is sort of increasingly horrible, like, why would you want to watch horror films and kind of revisit the horrors? But I think one of the things that it does very well is help understand sort of how the monstrous can become a form of resistance to the sort of structural oppressions that are aligned against people, and not just in a simplistic way. It's sort of unpacking the complexities of how monstrous resistance might function. It's easy to say, like, you need to almost become a monster in some cases to adequately resist a system that is monstrous. But I think, what you get through revisiting many of these horror films is a more refined understanding of what that might mean in different situations. So Stepford Daughters, looks at a cross section of different oppressions, everything from horror films that foreground trans subjectivity to horror films that foreground domestic servants and the specificities of those kinds of exploitation. And so I think in that regard, like, it's not at all the kind of like singular focus that it could have been if someone else had written this book. But I think what Joe has done quite expertly here is given a kind of wide range of types of horrors and types of resistance to those horrors as well. And so I was going to ask Joe about the idea that negation in horror can sometimes be, as she says, creative and liberating. And I'm hoping to sort of get a chance to ask her that later on. But I'm also, speaking from the province of Alberta, which is currently on fire. And, I had a chance to write recently for Blindfield Journal about The Last of Us, which was filmed in Alberta, and the ways in which the show was kind of almost taking advantage, not in an accusatory way, but taking advantage of some of the worsening conditions in Alberta to present a post-apocalyptic sort of fiction, and that's I think it was getting at maybe one of the questions that is answered repeatedly throughout Stepford Daughters, and that is the idea that what can horror offer us as we look at an increasingly horrifying world. So I was looking at The Last of Us in that essay for Blindfield Journal, and how they did things like the celebrated episode of the I forget the name of the episode, but it was the gay couple in a kind of bucolic suburb in the post-apocalyptic terrain. And they actually filmed that in a neighborhood that was evacuated because of historic flooding that happened back in 2013 in Alberta. And similarly, there's an episode in which the central character's history is explored at a shopping mall. And the mall that they used to film this episode was actually designated to be closed. And this is what gave them certain freedom to, film inside the mall and dress up the mall and do whatever they chose with it. So in other words, there are these sort of terrible conditions that in real life that are providing settings for the filming of a post-apocalyptic story. And you could sort of add to that in various ways as well. They actually filmed on the campus where I work, and and dressed it up to look like a post-apocalyptic setting. But it also invites people to think about how the symbol of this desiccated university campus in post-apocalyptic stories can function, either as a sign of some kind of decline, some kind of lost knowledge in that context, or as a potential break from a destructive social order. I think in the case of the show, it's supposed to be a kind of decline, but all of these, when they're filming a post-apocalyptic story like that, where you live and work, it kind of invites contemplation of the degree to which the society itself is moving in that direction already and swiftly. So horror, it can invite that kind of consideration, and it doesn't have to be sort of where you live in a specific location, as Joe indicates in Stepford Daughters with a number of examples. It is also just the sort of working conditions of where all of us live and try to survive. And I think that's, part of the sort of joy of reading the book, is that it's not simply reinforcing social decline in ways that perhaps many people who are familiar with leftist politics are already aware. It's kind of matching, some of our awareness of these conditions with the aesthetics of the moment through horror, and suggesting some possibilities for resistance, for in particular from a feminist and Marxist perspective. Let's see. There's a question here about Alberta. When looking at horror in an anti-capitalist approach, can one even not include ecofeminism in this approach? Or are they not intertwined? I think they have to be intertwined, especially in Stepford Daughters. The sort of the focus is on social reproduction, and you could include the ecological and the social in those as interconnected. You know, you cannot reproduce a social order without both the concerns of feminism and the concerns of environmentalism, or whatever you want to call it. And I think Joe correctly points out that colonialism and imperialism are sort of driven by a gender-defined form of exploitation. And so, yes, I would say absolutely, ecofeminism and anti-capitalism are intertwined for sure. I think we have Joe back.
When did I cut out? I just like did the whole presentation and then saw that I wasn't there somehow. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I think you were at just past the slide with La Llorona.
No.
Yeah. it was either that slide
been
or
a while.
Yeah.
I don't,
Hey,
because when I was talking, I could only see my slides. I couldn't see you guys, so I didn't see at all that I cut out or anything. So what should we do?
Pick it up from where you stop. Everyone would love to hear it.
All right. I am so sorry. Okay, so let's see. I will do the present again. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to resume presentation. Okay, so let's see. So it was all the way back here, eh? Okay.
The one where you had the picture of Hilda actually was the last I think we saw.
Okay. So I guess what I will do, is I'll just kind of flip back to this screen, because when I try to change the slides on this screen, I can't. So that's why I stayed on the slide screen, but I'll just kind of flip back to make sure I'm still here occasionally, so that doesn't happen again. You guys would not believe how great that presentation was. It was amazing. Yeah, just kidding. Okay, let me find where that is in here. Okay, there we go. All right, so in this horror scenario, capitalism lures women into low-paid or no-paid work while disinvesting from programs of social welfare, leading to what Nancy Fraser calls a crisis of care. The alternative offered to women is corporate lean-in feminism, in which, as Dawn Foster asserts, there is no room for a civil life, a political life, an emotional life outside the nuclear family unit. Contemporary horror has recognized the monstrosity of this individualistic lean-in logic, especially in the work of South Korean director Bong Joon-ho. In his film Snowpiercer, the world has come to a halt due to global warming, and the only survivors live on a circumnavigational train in which classes are segregated by separate cars. Tilda Swinton, costumed to resemble Margaret Thatcher, plays Minister Mason, one of the most powerful people on the train. However, she uses her female empowerment as an iron fist to ensure no one transgresses their subordinated class position. In another Joon-ho film, Parasite, the Kim family rise from being slum-dwelling pizza box assemblers to well-paid domestic workers, living in the wealthy home of their employers. But rather than use their newfound power to build solidarity with other workers, they compete and tear each other down. In these horror films, the instinct to lean in is shown to be a form of brutality that alienates people from each other and from their own humanity. Read in this light, horror films teach us that we must lean out into solidarity and structural change. And this struggle for total social transformation is a feminist issue. In short, class horror is gender horror, and we must think them together. Social reproduction feminisms hold that from the beginning, capitalism demanded a separation of spheres. It required productive labors to create commodities and to enable capitalism to constantly grow. But it also needed reproductive labors to ensure that workers were born, raised, fed, and emotionally cared for. Under capitalism, the ongoing strategy to produce and maintain this separation of spheres has always been gendered. Even though these two forms of labor are equally necessary, by labeling the feminized sphere of labor as less valuable and more natural, the ruling class has successfully blocked solidarity between men and women, as well as ensuring free or cheap reproductive labor. At the heart of this division, there is ever and always the threat of violence. Domestic violence and state violence follow the same logic. They enforce the rigid gendered division of labor and demand that the feminine sphere remains lower in the hierarchical order of things, keeping us all running through the endless Byzantine hedge maze of The Shining, where men, frustrated at their eternal inability to get ahead, project their murderous rage at the women who make their lives possible. In Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici traces the origins of this violence to the moment of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Under the feudal system, women and men often did the same work, and when work was gendered, it was valued more equally than at present. Federici argues that by labeling men's productive work as more valuable and offering the possibility of a subordinate female as a reward for this labor, capitalists effectively sabotage solidarity between men and women, when both should have been collaborating to defeat the enclosure of their lands and bodies. The witch hunts were then created to coerce ungovernable women into the role of passive, loving helpmeets. It took torturing, burning, and drowning so-called witches to turn them into obedient domestic subjects, and yet the work of these subjects is now framed as natural act of love. The 2015 horror film The Witch demonstrates this violence as Thomasin, a teenage girl, is forced into endless labor for her family and still labeled as a devil-worshipping witch. What is her sin? She unwittingly arouses the incestuous desires of the men around her. In fact, she is put in an impossible position where she is supposed to both satisfy male desire and avoid the incest taboo. For the inability to solve this impossible contradiction, she's punished gravely. However, as in many feminist horror films, The Witch shows that the witch hunts could not rid women of their rebellious spirits, and the identity of witch could be appropriated to bash back and live deliciously. At the end of The Witch, Thomasin leaves her family to live with a coven of witches. We hope her time will be spent flying, dancing naked, and doing strange but consensual rituals with Black Phillip, the goat devil who orchestrates her liberation. Before that, however, her life was filled with drudgery as she gathered food, tended animals, and cooked and cleaned for her joyless family. Strangely, in orthodox theories of Marxism, this type of labor has often been denied its rightful status as work. As Maya Gonzalez argues, this strict interpretation of Marx leads dogmatic Marxologists to assert that only organizing among laborers traditionally considered to be productive can lead to class struggle. Against this view, Gonzalez argues that feminist theories of reproduction make a political point. Women have traditionally inhabited the hidden abode of labor power's reproduction, and the work in this sphere is an integral precondition to the wage relation. This is one reason why Wages for Housework movement demanded a wage, to show that their work was structurally related to the wage rather than a moral or emotional issue. The horror outlined by social reproduction theories, then, is a kind of gaslighting of people who perform work outside the officially designated point of production, such as the factory or other obvious places of commodity production. In their exclusion from definitions of value and from categories of work that could build solidarity and class struggle, women and other feminized people are rendered mute and helpless. In having their work deemed as natural, they are alienated from their own suffering and desire to revolt. The silent scream a woman might nurse in the back of her throat as she cooks, cleans, and tends the baby can never escape her, lest she be accused of failing to love her family or of failing to behave as a real woman. But in horror, she screams, and screams loudly. Just look at the 2018 film Hereditary, where the protagonist Annie's experiences her family as an endless psychological assault and lets everyone in earshot know by wielding her voice as one long wail of sorrow. In the folk horror film Midsummer, a similar effect is deployed as protagonist Danny's sobs are unnaturally amplified to stress the horror of familial trauma. Both these films, quote, seem to open otherworldly portals to their own powers of horror, argues Sophie Lewis, by operatically staging the deeply intimate horror of the family. Says Lewis, to abolish the family, these images seem to whisper, would be to abolish the self. This naturalized, privatized sphere of the nuclear family may seem to be obsolete for some women, but its logic persists in other forms. As Leopoldina Fortunati argues, the family form serves as a nucleus of the relations of production for capitalism by forming a unit of production and reproduction of labor power. That is, the family is a hermetic microcosm of capitalism's two necessary spheres of labor, and these spheres are gendered. While the family form can be resisted by extended families, queer relationships, etc., the family still acts as a template to slot people into roles that appear to be freely chosen and mutual, but that actually compel subjects to act their parts in relations of production. Even in an age where choices other than the nuclear family seem to be available, the family form still defines roles and hierarchies. Current forms of care and emotional labor have been molded by the care work and emotional requisites that the family form demands. By exposing the terror of feminized activities in our moment, contemporary horror films both reflect the tyranny of the family form and the ways that a feminist preoccupation with the white middle-class housewife can lead to new forms of exclusion and violence. This problem is glaring in the most well-known feminist horror film, The Stepford Wives. Here, middle-class white women who yearn for independence are turned into robots who live only to cook, clean, and service their husbands. This scenario is truly horrific and illustrates the justified fear held by women who want to resist becoming subsumed by marriage and motherhood. But casually dropped into this iconic film is the racist classist notion that the solution to women's struggles would be to get a maid. With this unfortunate turn in an otherwise powerful feminist horror film, we learn a lot about which women are assumed to deserve empathy and protection. When considering reproductive labor, we fail as feminists if we stop with the image of middle-class housewife. Angela Davis has criticized the use of the housewife as the archetype of feminized labor. As she argues, this ignores the reality that Black women were rarely allowed to occupy this position. Many Black women and other women of color have been and still are forced to perform waged and unwaged reproductive labor, and at the same time, much of it domestic work for other people. This double burden of wage labor and housework must force a reconsideration of the struggles around reproductive labor. Compounded racism and sexism has meant that poor women and women of color have had to resist the infinite expansion of their work as they are asked to become surrogate housewives and to be underpaid for that undervalued labor. So even when the housewife held a significant social position, she was not the only role enforced by the gender division of labor, nor the most oppressed example. As women are increasingly entering the workforce or being relegated to the status of surplus population, we are grappling even more with the adaptability of the gendered division of labor. Capitalism has been spectacularly successful in using the gender distinction toward its own ends, as Juliana Spar and Joshua Clover argue, and this adaptability has allowed the role of the housewife to define wildly diverse forms of reproductive labor and activity. Like the victim in a slasher film then, the feminist dream of emancipation has been slit down the middle. Her hopes for equality are honored as long as she can lean into one of the dwindling jobs still commanding respect and high wages in our economy. But feminized reproductive labor itself is even further devalued, seen as an obstacle to success. This work is delegated to poor women, women of color, and immigrants who invisibly remove the debris in the path of the woman who has the privilege to lean in. The response must be refusal, and in this sense, horror's negation is utopian. In these films, feminized monsters and final girls embody the refusal of given roles and, in their negation, conjure insurgency and resistance. In this negative dimension of horror and its frank acknowledgement of violence that makes it is this negative dimension of horror and its frank acknowledgement of violence that makes it particularly suitable to capture contemporary contradictions of social reproduction. In 1978, the Marxist queer film critic Robin Wood made the convincing case that there is no better film genre than horror to express and contest the oppressions of capitalist patriarchy. Our culture, he argued, operates by forcing us to repress every thought, impulse, and emotion that goes against the standard of normalcy dictated by bourgeois patriarchy. Wood argues that this repression creates the category of the other, that which bourgeois ideology cannot recognize or accept. These repressed others appear in horror films as monstrous sources of fear. Says Wood, the true subject of the horror genre is the struggle for recognition of all that our civilization represses or oppresses. The reemergence of these repressions is dramatized as a horror, as in our nightmares. Relating to Wood's criticism, Barbara Creed and other psychoanalytically oriented feminist critics explore horror film as a privileged genre to investigate the repressed, which they call abjection. The abject refers to qualities and substances that are seen as so revolting that they must be excluded. For Creed and others, horror movies represent elements that the dominant patriarchal culture qualifies as feminine and deems unspeakably grotesque, such as irrationality, emotionality, and indeterminacy, as well as bodily excesses related to menstruation, sexuality, and pregnancy. These abjected qualities and substances map onto the sphere of reproductive labor that is cast out of the elevated sphere of masculine rationality and productive work. What feminist theorist Julia Kristeva calls the powers of horror are that it gives language to that which is rejected, repressed, stigmatized, and disavowed. In our moment, horror's power refers not only to what she names a rebellion of filthy, lustful, carnal female flesh, but the totality of feminized reproductive activities and qualities that are the repressed essence of everyday life. This repression is not only psychic, but social and historical, which contributes to the Gothic aesthetic of many horror films. As Teresa Gaudu argues, national history and self-mythologization is created through displacement and exclusion. Gothic themes have always served as a kind of resurrection of the repressed, disrupting the dream world of national myth with the nightmares of history. Sherry Marie Harrison argues that the Gothic tropes of darkness, madness, ghosts, and isolation bring historic repression of slavery, exploitation, and genocide to the surface. The female Gothic represents not only the horrors of history, but the fact that women have been erased from history. Historically speaking, women are always ghosts and specters, as their confinement to the private sphere has equated to a kind of public death. Even after women have emerged into public life, we are associated with the private, with passivity and lack, and these associations have deprived us of substantive representation. Horror films like The Others, in which a woman goes through life not knowing she is a ghost, force us to confront these historical erasures. Horror films' monsters and menaces are often described as uncanny. As Freud famously explained, the uncanny is a feeling of terror or alienation in the face of a phenomena that is familiar. The German word for uncanny is unheimlich, a word that can mean both familiar and agreeable, and concealed and kept out of sight. The word also refers to the home, conjuring the domestic horrors women face. The feeling of uncanniness arises not despite familiarity, but because of it, showing that the source of horror is not strangers or alien forces, but our most intimate relations and conditions. The horror genre is littered with lifelike dolls, mysterious doppelgangers, bodies possessed by demons and monsters, and bodies that are neither alive nor dead. These phenomena haunt us because of their proximity to ourselves, not because they are simply alien or different. In horror, this points to the sphere of intimacy and closeness as the locus of terror. The contemporary gendered division of labor produces uncanny effects and affects on a daily basis. We go through our everyday lives as if our behaviors, our work regimes, our emotions are perfectly natural, and yet we all have moments of terror, encountering ourselves as if we are strangers. Under a regime of feminized emotional labor, we smile at someone and wonder if that is our own smile or the smile we are required to wear. Our hearts are not our own, they are managed. As Arlie Hochschild demonstrates in her study of stewardesses' requisite emotional labor. We encounter our child and wonder if it is the person we love more than life or if she is the vehicle of our servitude. The possessed single mother in The Babadook, the hollowed out domestic workers in Get Out, the ancient demon disguised as a teenage son in Hereditary, the female body that is a foreign object to its owner in Under the Skin. All these are figures of the uncanny that express the self-alienation at work in late capitalist gendered dynamics. As the horror of feminized activity intensifies and becomes more evident, it's not surprising that horror's final girls have become more complicated. Rather than innocent victims, we see women as figures of retributive violence that is not always able to be rationalized as fair or heroic. As Neil King and Martha McCaughey argues, violent women in film are always shocking. Even feminist critics will insist that positive female characters should embrace the feminine quality of nonviolence. However, in horror, women are given access to what Jack Halberstam, following June Jordan, calls a place of rage. The representation of women committing acts of violence in horror allows for an opening, he says, between and beyond thought, action, response, activism, protest, anger, terror, murder, and detestation. Retributive violence shifts the ground of agency, showing that capitalist violence may not be able to continue with impunity. Excuse me. And so that was all kind of excerpts from my introduction of my book. And within the book, there's a lot more on very specific films, which I'd love to chat about if we have time. And so I'll just conclude by reading the final paragraph of the book that is just trying to be a little uplifting and hopeful about the possibilities of horror and its sort of kind of influence. The most important weapons offered in this book have nothing to do with watching movies. Rather, they are weapons of defense against the gaslighting forces that would frame our most beautiful gestures as monstrous. In Becoming Monster, we consider what reproductive labor might look like if we did it for ourselves. We reimagine care as what Kathy Weeks calls collective autonomy, rather than an ethic of work. We can, with Paolo Verno, understand that the refusal of work and negation is not simply saying no, it is a recognition of our own capacities and latent wealth, an abundance of possibilities. We join in women's strikes and mutual aid projects. We refuse to smile on demand and to be placidly date raped. We fight for clean air and safe places to live. We refuse jails and police brutality. As in the film False Positive, we suckle a mutant baby girl that a history of systemic rationalized misogyny tried to euthanize. As we turn to our rulers, covered in blood, a mutant child at our breast, we appear as grotesque abominations. But this is only because our beauty and care is no longer for them. We are monsters for each other.
Thanks very much, Joe, and I'm glad we had a chance to hear your full presentation.
I'm curious what happened in my absence.
However Godardian a fashion. The talk must have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order.
Exactly.
I have a couple of questions listening. I mean, endless number, but before the cycle of horror films really got going, it seems that the locus for any kind of feminism, such as it is, was the woman's picture, and particularly the melodrama for 30 years in Hollywood. The movies that would star Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford, obviously Douglas Sirk is the premier director of that. And so the question would be, what does the horror film why does it erupt when it does? And what does it offer that the melodrama doesn't? Watching your presentation, when you put Psycho on board, I thought this might actually be the moment where within the film itself, it shifts, starts off as a circuit melodrama with someone stealing money and having an adultery, and suddenly goes into this body horror of this creature, towards the end. So it's a fascinating shift, but obviously uh, the horror movie offers possibilities of registering things that the melodrama doesn't. So I'm interested in everybody's reaction as to what these might be. First question.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with. I think there's a deep continuity between melodrama and contemporary horror. And when you look at work like Ari Aster's, like Midsummer and Hereditary, I think those are melodramas. They're and more influenced by melodrama than like 70s horror, maybe. Than Cronenberg or something like that in terms of an art form. And because I do think there's a huge overlap of the work that they do to kind of magnify emotions, magnify the terrors of sort of intimate life. I do think that's a really interesting question about periodizing it, seeing it as a continuity and then periodizing it as a shift. And I do wonder, because of what I'm trying to argue in this book, that so many of the terrors that were in the private sphere are now erupting into sort of all of public life and all of work life, that perhaps the kind of claustrophobia that characterizes melodrama that's about this interior is needs to be reframed somehow. And so a shift to show that it's sort of seeping into the social fabric of the public, and also the intensification of the violence of that kind of private violence makes people that are clearly working in the vein of melodrama, like Ari Aster, decide to work in the genre of horror rather than to just because then when you see I mean, I love Todd Haynes, but I've had a lot of people say they don't really love just the kind of rehearsing of Douglas Sirk as like just kind of a new form. But this, something like Hereditary, actually really kind of reinterprets the genre in a way that seems much more contemporary and less pastiche too. I'd be curious what other folks think too. Yeah.
That leads to the second question, which had to do with iconic actors for this kind of, and specifically Toni Collette was going to come up. I was going to say that there seem to be some people like Tilda Swinton and Toni Collette who embody in their great performance in horror films like a level that no one else can get. With Swinton, it's a little, she's absolutely amazing in everything. So maybe not not as interesting a possibility as Collette, who phones in a lot of performances where she's playing cops or whatever in Hollywood movies, but in something like Hereditary, and you really capture that with the still, her mouth seems to open wider than a human mouth can open, literally to the point where she seems to be able to embody the monstrous and the monster, have it within her own body better than, almost anyone. I mean, Hereditary is just a shattering movie. It works on so many levels, but just in the sense that let's say Crawford and Stanwyck were the melodrama queens. Who would you list as actors who are the the kind of people who are figures for this horror turn?
I love that question. I think you are inside my brain, Philip, right now, because I got so mad at the Oscars. I mean, I can't watch them, but that all the great actors, to me, especially women actors, are in these horror films, and they're completely ignored like you say, Toni Collette, Tilda Swinton, oh my gosh, my brain, Nyong'o from Us, amazing. The performance in Get Out of the Georgina character is one of the best performances I've seen. Mia Goth is just a complete genius, and she wasn't quite on the field when I was writing this the way she is now, but she, I think, deserved to win. And I think not only are these actors ignored because of the genre is degraded, but because there's a fear of Brechtian acting. I would qualify, and I've been kind of like obsessed with this lately, which is why it's so funny that you asked, is that I think they're all doing this kind of non-naturalistic Brechtian acting, which, like, exactly like you say, like the mouth is open a little too much, the voice is a little too loud, and it's a way of distantiating us from these sort of naturalized emotions that's so intellectual. Like, I think of all those actors as just great, like, intellectual actors, and that denaturalization is just very taboo in popular culture or in mainstream culture, because it denaturalizes like emotions that we're supposed to believe in, right? You know, the kind of, we're supposed to like feel these emotions that capitalism tells us to feel without questioning them. And, you know, as Brecht argues, that's like a primary form of ideology that the actor has to kind of, you know, defamiliarize themselves from, and to show how those emotions are actually constructed by capitalism and are not just natural things that emanate from the individual. And I think all those female actors are just banging it up with that kind of Brechtian acting. So thanks for that question.
That's very interesting. Michael and Sophie, do you have on this strand
of? Not too much. I'm mostly interested in Joe's thoughts. I was just thinking while you're talking that you know, maybe the kind of alienating performance could be a way in Hereditary of trying to undermine the expected narrative that you know, that it's about like feminine hysteria and being passed along, you know, through the family, and it could be working against that through excess, in essence.
Yeah, I think those horror tropes, and that kind of gets to like Philip's first question of, you know, when Toni Collette shifts from being really upset to just like completely shutting down and being possessed. Yeah, it shows that it's not some kind of natural female hysteria, but that there's these kind of social outside forces at work that are kind of directing her emotional shifts. So I think that's an excellent reading of that. And I think, yeah, all these films, you really cannot see these as just like hysterical women, because they're constantly wrenched from one kind of emotional state to another by these external forces. So I think that's a great reading of it.
I think I'll just add to this by kind of reiterating. I think, Joe, you didn't hear me and Michael sort of patching. I like what Phil said about the beginning, middle, and end, not necessarily in that order. That's how this is going for sure. But I love the way in which your book presents an immanent critique and models the things it's talking about, the things that it is showing horror doing. And specifically, the image I have again and again with your method, which I guess I would call critically utopian as a sort of negation of the natural and the given, is that, you know, in classic form, when social reproduction theory is done well, it helps us kind of go into the factory, the hidden abode of production that Marx kind of reveals as so violent, and then go to the back of that factory and sort of find another curtain and see the even more, the hidden abode of reproduction. And there you sort of show how the impunity that is given to private figures of patriarchy generates bathtubs full of blood, or kitchens that are suddenly deeply menacing spaces. And you and I have had so much to say together about movies where the call is coming from inside the house, or that indeed the monster is not invading the home from the outside, but is the private character of care that is called the family in capitalist history. I guess I'm going to try and segue into asking you specifically then about the film you suggested we might put on the table, Barbarian, because in Barbarian, which is this debut horror movie, we almost find an image of Detroit, which is significant geographically. This is a kind of approach to the destruction of Detroit that focuses on the hidden abode of reproduction, in the sense that it puts it in the basement. So we have an Airbnb as our site, which in itself is brilliant. And I must say, I really enjoyed some of the jokes that people made. I think I wrote a couple down. I think there was some people on Letterboxd who said things like, you can't spell barbarian without Airbnb.
You can.
But perhaps even better, I think someone said, the worst thing about all of this is that I would still give the Airbnb a good review for fear of not being right. So what we find, I mean, I guess spoiler alert, but Joe, you love spoiling things. I have the same problem. The revelation of the horror is that a husband has taken his wife underground, enslaved her, bred her, and she, in fact, her excessive urge to mother, to feed, to give milk, is the terrible, destructive, eruptive, subterranean presence. Why? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I didn't really think it through completely, because I wasn't sure if we were going to end up doing that. But I thought that it wasn't some innate thing about mothering, because remember that character, the man who kidnaps and buries this woman underground, when he's at the store shopping for his victim, because he tries to impregnate these women and put them under, the saleswoman gives him a video of how to breastfeed, and that's the only thing she has down there to watch, is this video on breastfeeding, and is given no other cultural or social or any touchstone of life. So she's sort of limited to that role of mother by his entrapment. And his entrapment is this extension of white sort of Detroit resentment against the sort of, creeping sort of integration of the neighborhood, and his feeling of entitlement to be this sort of this lord of the manor in this way that seeps out into the urban politics of Barbarian. So I thought she was the heroine. The monster was a heroine, that really, in this very concrete way of she, her acting of motherhood is this kind of revenge, and making them these male figures, breastfeed. It's almost like that sort of converges with that finale of the book that I was reading, of just okay, you want us to be mothers? Well, here's here's how we're going to do it in my world. And then it's really interesting because she takes the protagonist, the kind of upper, this woman who's trying to succeed in the present and who rents the Airbnb as her child, that is kind of the inheritor, and that woman has to sort of decide how she feels about this mother figure who is actually protecting her but also a monster, and shows like that kind of choice that women are given now is either lean in and fight against your sisters who are like repressed into these like weird caretaking roles, or become one of them. And she's in a like almost in this kind of contradictory position at the end. I almost wish, well, I won't spoil the very last minute because that's cruel, I guess. But the way they decided to end the very, very end of that movie, I wish they'd done it differently a little bit, because I think we see what choice she made, which I would have rather seen as an open-ending choice. Not. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I think you're pinpointing that this mothering eruption is sympathetic in a strange way. It is maybe too elementary a point, but a lot of the things you clearly from the chat of this event, it's not a familiar point that the monstrous and the monsters in horror in this genre might be comrades, right? And yet, so it bears kind of making explicit. But it's complicated. A lot of the things that violently happen in horror movies might be necessary for liberation, whilst also having quite unbearable effects in and of themselves, or at least, right? This is the thing about killing joy, or the joy of killing joy, and the bloodiness of revolutionary change, I suppose. But I'm convinced by this reading. Michael, did you have anything to say about Barbarian, or?
Just a more general comment, like maybe the number of films that you look at in Stepford Daughters that are comfortable not ending with the restoration of order. Yeah. Or, like I think of what's the most boring parts of horror tend to be like the wave of slasher films that had this very conservative ethos about, the family is invaded by a killer, and the third act is kill the monster and restore order, the end. And I think many of these films are kind of interesting because they either end ambiguously or they end with a totally new order of things.
Yeah, a lot of people had, especially before the present, argued that horror was a conservative genre, precisely because of what you're saying, because it ends with that restoration, and it's about this sort of purging of the fear of the other, or kind of catharsis of that, those worries. And I think a lot of the sort of redeeming readings of that had to be kind of against the grain, which was, those restorations could not undo. And I think Robin Wood does that a lot with his readings of films. They can't undo all the madness and mayhem that has happened, in the ways that all the norms have been upended by the monster. But yeah, I think it's really interesting now that there's, I think partially because the creation of horror film has opened up a lot. Like I mentioned in my introduction, I was just picking films that looked interesting from my point of view, but out of the 20 films that I look at, only like 4 are by like white cis men, and that would, directed by white cis men, and that would never, you couldn't possibly find like 16 horror films in the 70s that were, you'd have to really look for that kind of that ratio. So it's opening up to like diverse creators, I think. and there's like a kind, I think, partially just because of streaming and things like that, they're cheaper to make, and so that there's a less capital intensive, and so they can be more niche projects, or just the niche nature of culture in general now. So I think that kind of imperative to restore order that was so ideologically cemented into every genre is loosening, and you get a lot of really interesting voices of that are creating horror, that are allowed to be overt in kind of rooting for chaos or rooting for the monster in this way that is really important. And I think it's important that we really look carefully at women as monsters, and don't see that as a degradation, because I think when we're always looking for positive representation, it kind of goes along with what like Jameson says about utopia. Like, yes, if you create the positive utopia, you're actually only limiting yourself to like what we can think about now as positive. And it's true with like women characters. I think even if you limit yourself to just positive representations of women, then you're ruling out the possibilities beyond our movement. And I think that's what's so amazing and risky about what Sophie does with family abolition, is like that is monstrous to most people, the terror of like what something beyond the family. I think a lot of these characters are showing that, but we have to imagine that to get beyond what we have now, even if it's terrifying, and even if it's bloody, or like we have to have an expansive imagination, and some of these characters, I think, in that vein, I guess.
Yeah.
Joe, we must be on the same wavelength, because you anticipated the question I was going to ask each person, to pick one film on the other side that represents in a certain way a kind of utopian contrast to all of these horrible films of imprisonment and so forth that we've seen. I was going to throw into the mix The Little Hours with Aubrey Plaza and various people like Fred Armisen and so forth, which is supposedly based on a Decameron story, but kind of set in a monastery where all the nuns, sort of led by Aubrey Plaza, going into the woods for very enjoyable witchcraft ceremonies, and the male figures are all buffoons. And in a certain way, Aubrey Plaza, with her kind of insolent, take no shit, desire to explore anything attitude, seems to represent something that's totally opposite to the wide mouth over the screaming. So I would throw that in. Obviously you can find films like Daisies, un-American films, non-American films, but I'm wondering, among contemporary films that people might have seen, which ones do you think embody a certain utopian aspiration? One for each person.
Shoplifters by Hirokazu Koreeda. I think a lot of people saw that, 2018. That's a film. That's a sort of anti-family that relies on shoplifting. And I thought that its vision of communal luxury and non-familial solidarity and queer care was pretty utopic.
Yeah, and kind of going on Sophie's thing, my last chapter is I call it kind of coming of rage, and it's about sort of depictions of young youth, especially young women in horror, and I think a lot of them kind of show these collectivities. But the opening slide I had was for Assassination Nation, and it's like the world they live in is not utopian, but the kind of collectivity of the young women and the kind of transformation from people who just live online all the time to being this kind of revolutionary cadre with a bunch of young women is pretty utopian. What about you, Michael?
I don't know. I was thinking of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but yeah, I mean, it's not utopian, but I think we've seen in recent years like a return to the cannibal family and I guess similar tropes. I mean that one's kind of like the era of the Manson family, and which just had its like 50th anniversary not long ago. But yeah, I don't know. I can't think of many utopian expressions right now. I think I'll just settle with Texas Chainsaw.
There's a good question here from chat. So I will read it then. If Joe were to write a script for a horror movie, what would it look like? What important elements would she include? The same question for all the cameras. So everyone answer one after.
Oh wow, that's super hard, but I just like what element. But I will say, my housemates and I have been brainstorming a horror film for a long time. We're shifting into second gear with it, so I'll just tell you what that's about. Which is there's this old film from the 60s called Carnival of Souls, and it's about what do you guys think? Can I do a spoiler with that one? It's from the 60s. I don't know. Yeah, because it really is important what it's about. But it's basically this woman who is, gets in a car accident, and then she kind of like somehow it falls into the water and somehow comes back a few hours later unhurt. And she goes on to do all this sort of this work as a church organist from town to town. And really is not involved with her job and not involved with other people and very dissociated. And it turns out at the end that she's been dead all along, but like it kind of goes along with her dissociation from her job. So we're thinking about redoing that with gig work and especially adjunct teaching of like a woman who is going around driving for Grubhub and doing adjunct teaching and only realizes towards the end that she's dead. So we're kind of a loose remake of the film. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's an example of sort of thinking about feminized temporary labor in these sort of horror modes and the ways and the sort of kind of outsized emotions that it requires, and so it kind of has everything for me. So I don't know. That's we're in the stage of thinking we're going to do it as a guerrilla DIY film. So if anybody knows anything about film, please get in touch about making films. Get in touch with me.
I'm actually going to answer that question by reading from Stepford Daughters, chapter 2. Here are some ideas I have for the scariest horror film ever. A woman is filmed clinging to the window ledge of the apartment she cleans. It is 7 stories up. She calls out to her employer for help. Hold me, hold me. The employer does not put down the camera. She merely films, laughing. 3 children see their mother migrate to a wealthy country in order to support them. They do not hear from her for 2 years. Finally, her body is found in the freezer of an abandoned apartment. And finally, a housekeeper becomes partially deaf after her employer sticks a pair of scissors in her ear. These stories are not fiction. They are real life accounts of women who perform domestic work, right? These are news stories. That's, the thing that Joe kind of tempts us to conclude a lot of the time, that nothing can be as horrifying as the reality of living in this capitalist reality. So that would be my contribution.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I mean, that one of the arguments I'm trying to make is, it has to be real. Like, to me, horror is the new realism. And what is called realism is often sentimentalization, and one example I like to use in contrast with the examples that Sophie brought up is Roma, which was hailed as this realist triumph about a maid and the family that she lives with and the emotional ties they build. And you kind of have to, if you're going to depict a maid and the family that she's so intimate with, focus on those sort of ties. But the films that I address in the chapter that Sophie's referencing to about women who do wage domestic work inside people's houses can actually show the real violence that are in those relationships, even if they're not overtly expressed, because it has kind of forms of estrangement, the Brechtian acting we were talking about, but also the sort of horror tropes like slow escalation of horror and the Gothic modes that help us see violence that isn't on the surface and so is difficult to represent within the realist genre. So I guess that would be the more structural answer to that excellent question of like how you would write a script, is like think about it as realism, right? How can I tell these stories that aren't getting told, and how can I use horror tropes to express the things that in naturalistic dialogue and framing that you can't really express because we have so much ideology like lumped onto the ways these relationships work in so-called realist cinema.
Michael?
I guess I would try to make a contribution to the workplace horror subgenre. There's quite a few that literalize the capitalist war of all against all and turn it into like the Belko experiment or something where you're forced to literally eliminate your coworkers. But I would try to develop it in such a way that it comes to terms with the rising eliminationist logic on the far right today, and how we are going to deal with that. So I mean, it would be part of the most dangerous game sort of subgenre that seems to have had a resurgence in the past 10 years, and I think it's connected to that increasing rhetoric of elimination on the far right in particular. And somehow we have to come to terms with that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned the book, Annie McClanahan's Dead Pledges, but I think she has a wonderful point, which I'll restate in my own words and probably mar in some way or other. But the notion is the traditional realist novel, 19th century, is based on a kind of moral realism. A person keeps making choices, and the novel plays out in the climax as a consequence of their choice. But that particular form is very bad for registering things like the effects of capital or the financial crisis, which so far exceed an individual's actions, that every attempt to write novels about the financial crisis always gives us some sort of Great Gatsby-ish choice by Nick Carraway, of people, someone who chooses to quit the hedge fund or to stay in the hedge fund. It just doesn't do for the scale of what we're dealing with, and that horror is the only genre, one of the only genres that, because of its stylization and its Brechticization, that can essentially kind of make it work. And I don't know, that might bring us back to Parasite for a second, because there is someone who said that you cut out about the time you were talking about Parasite, and they're very interested in hearing what you have to say about Parasite, which is a good example of something dealing with capitalism. So why don't we just sort of take this as the last question or comment, and let's hear your take on Parasite.
Sure. Yeah, I think that might be one of the most amazing films. I have that one in my chapter that's about sort of emotional labor, and one of the things that I want to stress in the book is, even though the feminist issue of emotional labor is not just women, right? It's all, so many laborers are feminized in that the work that they are required to do is gendered in this way of service work and various other forms of emotional work. And the ideological kind of problem of getting into that work is so well shown by the family of Parasite, because their thing is that they are so excellent at emotional labor that they wheedle their way to, they think they're going to kind of rise in class from these like living underground pizza box makers into this, like, and they do, they end up all moving into this house on a hill, like vertically moving up in the world. But because emotional labor requires what Arlie Hochschild calls like deep acting, it sort of infuses their whole personality, and they become the person they're acting, and they can't see the way that the labor is being extracted more than that they're getting up in the world. And so you see the film, kind of fulfill this parabola where they rise and rise and rise, but they end up lower than they started because they, invest everything in this emotional labor, and they don't see that it's actually preventing them from having solidarity with other working class people, because they see themselves as better at this and people who can join this higher class. But what causes their downfall is that they run into other working class people who are also trying to, and instead of fighting the boss, they fight each other, and they all lose, right? And this pertains to the women in the family, the men in the family. Everybody is kind of in the thralls of this emotional labor that kind of takes over their lives. So I think it's, as Bong Joon-ho says, we're all living in this one world, which is capitalism, right? And that's kind of one of his theses for the movie, and it really just shows that so well.
Sophie or Michael, you have a comment on Parasite?
I'm going to use the prompt to think about a genre we didn't get to name, the new burgeoning sort of influencer horror genre. And my segue is going to be around the idea of parasitism. I mean, it's basic, but perhaps I actually want to offer the possibility that the very idea of parasitism is called into question in an anti-work Marxist feminism or anti-capitalist feminism that really seeks to unmake the work ethic, what Kathy Weeks calls an ethic of work, and think outside of both productivity and reproductivity as moral praise, which is a way of thinking and a way of desiring that we may not even be fully capable of yet. And I do think that one of the ways in which the sort of right or freedom to exist outside of sort of productivity or reproductivity does often kind of come through in horror about these, ultra feminized sort of spheres of industry right now. Influencers are perhaps the ultimate kind of denigrated as pointless, as fake, as not deserving of their incomes kind of category. And, Joe addresses this a little in Stepford Daughters. My partner, who is no cop zone on Letterboxd, made a handy list for me of influencer horror that in 3 tiers: pure symptom, interesting critique, and then some interesting combo of the both. So these are movies like The Seed, Tragedy Girls, which Joe has written on, Dash Cam, Follow Me, Sissy, Hatchling, Ingrid Goes West, Cam, Superhost, Deadstream, Shook, Bodies. And I just wanted to sort of shoehorn that in there before we close up, because as well as the figure of the influencer, I am, hoping that on on the far left in feminist circles, we can collectively have our feelers out for trends in the sphere that we hold up as scary, as horrifying, that we owe solidarity to, right? So not just kind of the feminized influencer teenagers, but also the horror of the autonomous child, the trans child. Vicky, my partner, likes to think about egg cinema, as in the hatching of trans eggs, the cinema that is kind of lurking inside cisness but bursting to get out. The figure of the unruly gestator who threatening to withdraw their gestational labor. These are the sort of specters that I'm expecting to perceive in the feminist horror movie making of this moment. And I don't know, I just hope that Joe keeps writing amazing reviews and reflections on that form of art that is so important, I think, to imagining monstrous, livable cyborg futures on this planet. I'm really grateful to you for writing that book, and to Red May for hosting this panel.
Yeah, it's such a dream. I just love. I mean, I've gotten to participate in Red May a little bit in the past, but and it's just always been the highlight of my year. I mean, everybody, the whole thing, Philip, is just such an amazing event. So I really appreciate this.
Next year we need to do a festival that you curate at the Beacon Theater.
Ooh, I'm down. Definitely.
Michael, you got a comment on Parasite or anything?
I just wanted to say that I think Joe should release the coda to the book as a kind of manifesto, because it's very inspiring writing and captures some of the themes in a very concise way. It's a very exhilarating way to end this very smart book.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's been such a pleasure. And I also wanted just one more time to tout Common Notions, because they would not have written it without them. They just saw some of my writings on Blind Field and got in touch with me, Andy Battle in particular, and asked and encouraged me to do this. And for those of us who are trying to work as, write and aren't at a research university, that kind of connection to this and to Common Notions is just like our lives. It's like what makes us able to have conversations and able to feel like it's meaningful what we're doing and stuff. So I couldn't be more appreciative of both Red May and Common Notions.
I guess I'll just, Parasite, put in a plug for the Korean New Wave, Bong Joon-ho, Chan Park-wook, lots of other directors. Watch everything you can by them. They're really amazing films. There's a vampire film called Thirst. I forget who directed it, but we highly recommend those. So thank you for coming to this discussion, all of you who watched it. And if you like this, we have a month of events. Go to www.redmayseattle.org. You can look at our schedule, find out what the other events are, and give us something in Patreon so we can continue to put these on. Thanks very much, and thank you, Joe, Michael, and Sophie.